My father refused to pay my tuition fees to save it all for my golden younger brother. I became a famous chef. During the restaurant opening ceremony, I, 32 AM, have a younger brother, 28, and we have been raised by our father, 56 AM, since we were in middle school. My father has always preferred my brother above me, and I became accustomed to it. My father never wanted a son like me, since, unlike him, I had no interest in sports or performing masculine things that males do. I was always more into traditionally feminine things, which is why I was such a mama's boy growing up. I loved cooking, reading, and even singing. My father tried to have me play football with him, but I was terrible at it, so we gradually drifted away. My brother, on the other hand, was just the type of son that my father desired. He was a rough and tough youngster who wasn't scared to get dirty or harmed when playing. He was the ideal son for my father, and it was clear that he adored my brother far more than he loved me. He always had positive things to say about my brother, but never about me. However, my mother never played favorites. She was fair to both of us, which made me love her even more. I made an effort to befriend my father and spend time with him, but once we'd grown apart, he didn't seem interested in repairing our connection either. Unfortunately, the glue that held our dysfunctional family together, my mother, died while I was in 8th grade. She had cancer, and by the time we learned it, it was too late to save her. She died before we knew it. My mother's death crushed me, and I sort of slid during that period. My sole refuge was the kitchen, where I'd cook something fresh every day as if my life depended on it. My mother was an excellent cook, and she often told me that if she hadn't been forced to take over her father's business, she would have become a chef. Cooking was the one thing that made me feel better because my father and brother were unable to deal with my emotions. They suppressed any emotional reaction to my mother's death and, if anything, became even more distant from me. In a normal family, something like this would have brought us together. My obsession with cooking irritated my father even more, and he would constantly remind me to get out of the kitchen and do something more macho. When he had had enough, he informed me that if he caught me in the kitchen again, he would have me do all of the other home chores as well. He advised me to be more like my brother and man up, which resulted in a heated argument in which I told him he never loved me, and he agreed. It was finally out in the open, and I believe that was the last time my father and I spoke frankly, because after that, I stopped trying to win him over completely, and he didn't seem to care either. For the following many years, I spent all of my time in my room, listening to music and researching new recipes. I was determined to make this chef thing work for both me and my mother. Meanwhile, my father and I communicated only when absolutely necessary. My brother didn't care much for me and ignored me, just like our father did. So once my mother died, I really didn't have anyone to rely on. Finally, when it came time to apply to universities, I chose to apply to a couple top culinary schools as well as traditional colleges to ensure that I had a chance. I wasn't sure whether my father would agree, but I had to try at the very least. I'd already discreetly interned at a restaurant that summer, gained some experience, and convinced them to write a recommendation letter for me. Since then, it has been quite beneficial, so I was accepted into several of the institutions I applied to, including one of the top, which happened to be in France. I was overjoyed that this was finally happening for me, but I was also anxious because it meant having to ask my father for permission. I'd already decided to beg him to let me leave if he sounded hesitant, since I knew I had to do this for myself. I was not willing to give up on my dreams under any circumstances, so I ultimately told my father about it, and while I was prepared for him to reject my request, claiming that it was not a masculine career, I was not expecting him to refuse to finance my tuition at all. I recall being perplexed when he told me that he would not be paying for my schooling at all, despite the fact that my father was not in any way destitute. He was actually quite wealthy and could easily afford to send me to France. But money was not the reason he wasn't willing to pay for my school. It was a fact that if I went to France and attended such a prestigious institution, my younger brother would feel insecure. He was struggling with his grades and couldn't focus. So my father wanted me to either attend a community college or find a method to pay for my own education. I was astounded that he would be so nasty to his own son and had no idea what to say to him. I attempted to explain why I needed this, but he was adamantly opposed and refused to pay for my tuition. He even informed me that my brother's well-being was his first priority, and he did not want me to compete with his kid. I couldn't believe it was happening, since no other father in the world would ruin their child's hopes like this simply for their favorite. After much pleading and tears, when he still refused to budge, I ended up in a large argument with him, saying a lot of things to him before leaving his house for good. I began living with my maternal aunt. my mother's older sister. The main reason I hadn't moved out earlier was because I found comfort in the house where I had grown up with my mother, and I didn't want to change schools, which I would have had to do if I moved in with my aunt, who lived rather far away from the high school I attended. I told her everything about my father, how he had flatly refused to pay my tuition, and how I needed her support. I felt awful asking her for so much money because she wasn't as wealthy as my father, but she told me that she'd cover all of my expenditures. She somehow managed to rally all of her friends and send me to the culinary school of my dreams, for which I will be eternally thankful. When I arrived, I also worked part-time and attempted to make the most of my time there in order to justify all of the money spent on me. I worked extremely hard and made my way up. I graduated as one of the most proficient cooks, and I even got a job a few months later. I started working in a high-end French restaurant, and I'd send half of my paycheck back to my aunt to pay off whatever debts I had. Slowly but surely, I was grateful that I didn't have to rely on a student loan, or else I might never be able to repay it. I spent a few years working in France before returning home when I had accumulated enough money to launch my own restaurant. It's been a few years, and in the meantime, I've worked as the head chef at another restaurant here, while still working toward my long-term ambition of starting my own restaurant. It was all resolved a few weeks ago, and I was finally able to open the restaurant that I had been working on for so long. Two of my friends from when I was in France joined in on my business idea and are now co-owners with me, so I was thrilled when they let me choose the name for the restaurant. They are from the same state, therefore we were all fine with starting our restaurant in my preferred city as well. I chose to name it after my mother, which was a wonderful coincidence for us because my mother had a very lovely and unique name in the city where we lived. Everything was finally falling into place. We even held a small celebration for a few select guests a few days ago, before formally opening for business. Of course, I invited my aunt and a couple of her friends, who had also helped pay for my education. I also invited some of my friends back from school, but that was about it. I didn't invite my father or brother for obvious reasons. Even if I had wanted to, I couldn't have because I hadn't spoken to them since I left home, and they had never bothered to contact me. I suppose all of us were better off this way, but I should have known that they would eventually show up to capitalize on my accomplishment, and that is exactly what happened during the party we hosted. They arrived an hour before the party was scheduled to begin, but were not stopped by security since we shared a last name, and they said they were there to surprise me. At the very least, that was accurate. I was astonished when I saw them. My father and brother greeted me as if nothing bad had happened in the past, and were extremely kind to me, maybe for the first time in my life. I was so surprised to see them that I just froze as they walked into the restaurant. My friends felt something was amiss, and after respectfully welcoming my family, they left us alone. I'm grateful that they were able to detect my unease. I still hadn't recovered from the shock of seeing them again when they dropped another bomb on me and presented me with a gift. It was a portrait of my mother, and my father informed me he had commissioned it for me to hang in my restaurant. When Dad heard that a new upscale restaurant with this name was opening in our city, he knew it had to be his son, and he even told me that he had always known I had it in me. My brother, too, was jumping on the bandwagon, complimenting me and saying he was very proud of me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and I realized there was something unusual about it all. I didn't say anything, just waited for them to get to the point because I knew they had a reason for being here. I let them speak, and they ultimately got to why they were here. Apparently, my brother was now working as a bartender, which was only possible because my father had convinced a friend of his to hire him at his club. My brother's grades had steadily declined throughout high school and college, which is why he did not land the high-paying jobs that my father had always anticipated of him. Furthermore, he had been slacking throughout his high school football games, which prevented him from receiving a sports scholarship. Ironically, he was the one who ended up having to attend community college after being denied everywhere else. They wanted me to make my brother a partner in the business so that he could have a more respectable position, despite the fact that he had done nothing to earn it. I wanted to laugh in their faces, but I managed to hold back and instead told them I'd think about it. I wasn't going to think about it, though. I simply didn't want to turn them away. I wanted them to stay for the celebration because I had a much better plan to embarrass my family, who would appear out of nowhere once they learned of my achievement. They appeared pleased, but they had no idea what was going to happen. After a while, our guests began to arrive, and everyone we'd invited was present within an hour. I spent the evening chatting with my father and brother, and I even overheard them bragging about me to a few people as I marveled at their audacity. Towards the end of the party, it was time for the hosts, meaning myself and my partners, to make a toast. My pals went first, since I wanted to keep the best for last. Then it was my turn to speak, and I was going to say everything I had in my heart that day. I began by thanking all of my visitors and raising a drink to my mother first, as she was the reason I'd ever been able to accomplish so much. I was convinced that her faith in me as a youngster was what inspired me to believe I could do anything, and that it lingered with me even after she died. After I had paid my respects, I resolved to address the disrespect as well. I mentioned that I had to borrow a loan from my aunt and her friends to go to culinary school, and I thanked her. Finally, I got to the real reason I needed to take out a loan for my tuition, my family. I mentioned how I grew up with a father who never loved or believed in me and constantly chastised me for having feminine interests like cooking, as well as a younger brother who was an exact clone of my father. I told them all about how my father refused to pay for my education out of concern that I would become more successful than my younger brother, who was his golden child, which led to me fleeing home. But despite all odds, I was able to rise and become who I am today, so they do deserve some credit for generating all of the difficulties I've had to overcome. Otherwise, I would never have discovered how resilient I am. While I was saying all of this, a number of people gave my father and brother the nastiest looks they could manage, and even they had the good sense to appear humiliated, even though I knew they didn't feel that way in the least. Anyway, I walked over to my father and brother and hugged them, maintaining the same demeanor as when they visited me today. This game might be played by two players. I said that because they had come to celebrate my success today, I had forgiven them for whatever had happened in the past, and was even willing to give my brother the position of bartender at my establishment. Other people saw this as a really emotional reunion, and they ended up clapping for me at the end of my speech, along with a few wolf whistles. Only my family and I knew that this was nothing more than an attempt to embarrass them, which I had accomplished very successfully, but they had to smile and pretend as if they were extremely grateful for what I had done because they couldn't exactly storm out violently as they wanted. After a while, when the audience had dispersed and it was time to go home, my father and brother confronted me immediately outside my business. They were outraged, and I swear my brother had angry tears in his eyes. They demanded an explanation for what I'd done, and if I hadn't intended to make my brother a partner, I should have turned them away the moment they arrived. I just chuckled and told them that this was my way of repaying them for all that they had done for me over the years, and it was exactly what they deserved. Then I walked away without looking back, even though I could hear my brother crying about how this was the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to him. My father was also furious and yelled at me, telling me that I'd regret it, but I didn't care because I was already in my car and driving away. That happened a few days ago, and I have not heard from them since. My aunt feels I went too far with this one and should have just kicked them out at first, but I disagree. This was definitely deserved, especially after humiliating my father and brother. Update #1. Hello. I decided not to contact my family to apologize. Regardless of what my aunt said about me being overly harsh, I don't feel sorry for what I did, so I'm not going to pretend I do and go out of my way to say so. They could have apologized to me during their visit, but they did not. I also told this to my aunt, and while she agrees I should not have done what I did, she hasn't said anything about it. I suppose this is one of those instances where we agree to differ, and I'm fine with that. In other news, my brother has made it a point to speak negatively about me to all of our old school pals. It's bad that we went to the same high school because this simply means that random individuals from school are now messaging to confirm stories that I humiliated and then kicked out my father and brother from my business after intentionally feeding them 3-day-old food. Yes, he exaggerated the story to make himself appear as the victim, which is not uncommon. Ordinarily, I wouldn't worry about minor rumors, but I don't want potential customers to take them seriously. So I told my brother that if he didn't stop spreading lies about me and my restaurant, he would lose his current job as well. I hope it works since I don't want to deal with their useless trash right now. I'm pretty busy at work, and now isn't the time. Update #2. My brother wrote back, stating he'd stop only if I made him a partner. I don't know what degree of foolishness and delusion this is. Furthermore, if he wants to be a partner, Isn't it a bad idea for him to complain about the same restaurant? I'm quite sure this is my father's strategy for ensuring his beloved son gets a high-profile position without doing any actual work, but it's not going to work for me. I've informed him that if he doesn't stop, he will hear from my lawyers, and that he is in no position to negotiate with me right now. The only reason I haven't done anything yet is that I don't want to get involved in unnecessary drama. But if he does anything funny after this, I'll absolutely mess him up, and he should take this as my final warning. I sincerely hope he does so for his own good. Update #3. So, it's been almost a month since the last update, and because I've been so busy, I haven't been able to update you on what transpired since then. My brother stopped gossiping about me behind my back, but they were still eager to share in on my achievement. So a few weeks ago, my father decided to pay me a visit with my brother, just to frighten me. They showed up at my house, threatening to sue me for using my mother's name for my business, and even said they had previously spoken with a lawyer. So, if I didn't want any problems, I needed to get my brother a partner as quickly as possible. Obviously, I called their bluff right away because no lawyer would take on such a ridiculous matter. I believe they overlooked an essential fact. She was also my mother, not only his wife, and no law could prevent me from taking her name. By then, I'd had enough of their nonsense, so I informed them that if they didn't leave me alone, they'd be forcing my hand, and I'd have no choice but to contact the police. At that time, my brother lost his rage and attempted to grasp my collar, but my father intervened. I believe the repeated humiliation had finally taken its toll, and he snapped. Well, it wasn't my fault, and they were lucky I didn't contact the cops immediately. I informed my father that he needed to leave, but he merely instructed my brother to go cool off in the car and that he wanted to speak with me privately. After my brother departed, he tried to influence me by telling me that if my mother knew what I was doing to them, she'd be furious with me and I should bury the hatchet. At this point, I told him to leave me alone because even I had reached my limit. He couldn't simply rely on my mother to get his way. That was just too low. And to be honest, we were well past the point of reconciliation. Neither of them had ever apologized to me, so I couldn't understand why they expected me to forgive them without asking. As for how my mother would feel, I'm sure she would have felt similarly let down when my father refused to pay for my tuition, and every other time he made me feel bad about myself. So he should be the last person to lecture me on what my mother would and would not appreciate. I know my mom is proud of me wherever she is, and nothing my father says will change that. At least my restaurant is going well, and perhaps we will be able to expand soon.